Hi, my name is Caleb, and I'm here today to present on our topic titled, Hey, I Hacked Your Skimmer, Lessons Learned in Embedded Device Security by Observing What Not to Do. If you're here to learn how to make a skimmer for yourselves, you're in the wrong virtual room. As I mentioned, my name is Caleb Davis, and Zane Hussain will also be presenting with me. So a little bit about me. I joined Protiviti in June of 2019, specifically the Emerging Technologies group, where we worked on penetration testing of IoT devices, cloud infrastructure, AI/ML, and quantum computing. I have a degree in electrical engineering from the University of Texas at Tyler, where I began my career as an embedded software developer at a residential HVAC company. As a software developer, I primarily focused on embedded C code on ARM core microcontrollers for HVAC controls. Being a developer also required me to focus on how to securely design embedded devices, which eventually led me to the much more enjoyable task of actually breaking things. Now I work as an embedded penetration tester where I focus on things like hardware, firmware, RF testing, APIs, web, and mobile application testing.
So hi everyone, my name is Zane Hussain. I also work as a security consultant at Protiviti alongside Caleb. I'm a bit newer to the team. I joined around 4 months ago. So I studied software engineering at the University of Texas at Dallas with a focus in information assurance. I like to work with my hands, and so I jumped at the opportunity to work on hardware for the Emerging Technologies group. I'm passionate about cars and use my skills to hack them. So let's take a look at our agenda. In this presentation, we'll first get an overview of the case. Then we'll dive into the card skimming device itself. After that, we'll talk about the process of data exfiltration and analysis. Then we'll go over the next steps and finally give examples of mitigations that can be taken. And at the end, we'll have some time for questions. All right, so what happened? The client found a skimmer on a POS system at a grocery store, removed it, and brought it to us. They wanted to understand what, if any, data was compromised. Our objective was to analyze the methodology used to skim and store credit card information, as well as recover any compromised data associated with the credit card skimmer. So what did we do? Well, we reviewed the card skimmer architecture and interfaces. We extracted the external flash memory from the onboard flash chip. We extracted the internal flash memory from the microcontroller unit, the MCU. We analyzed the extracted data for any sequences that could potentially be credit card numbers. We identified the Bluetooth interface pin from internal memory. And what was the result? Well, we were able to identify 95 potential credit card numbers for the client to validate with their records. And we were able to expose the Bluetooth pin, allowing us to connect through what is likely the intended interface used by the skimmers. So let's talk for a minute about the rise in credit card skimming. 47% of Americans have been victim to credit card fraud in the past 5 years. Card skimming fraud has increased at a rate of around 10% per year, which has enabled this next statistic and the fact that 35.4% of all credit card fraud in the US is related to counterfeit cards. And in 2016, losses topped $22.8 billion worldwide. So even if it doesn't seem like you might care about something like this, it's definitely affecting your life in one way or another. All right, so let's break down the actual card skimmer. So here's a look at the actual skimmer that the client presented to us next to the kind of POS system that it was found on in their stores. So this would be laid on top of the POS in that grocery store. Immediately, we can see a few things. At the bottom, you can see the PCB with its colored wiring. In the middle, we can see the keypad and its black wiring. And at the top, we can see a small battery. We'll take a closer look at the PCB in a minute, but immediately it appears that it was manufactured somewhere else and then obtained by this group. Our forensics team also noted the state of the dust and adhesive on the device indicated that the skimmer had not been deployed for a long period of time. So I'll pass it back to Caleb to break down exactly what we found on the PCB.
Sure, thanks, Zane. So the first step to analyzing a PCB is to review the board's major components. Most components have legible part numbers, which allow us to research data sheets and user manuals that contain in-depth information on the device and how it is intended to operate. Once we fully understand the primary function of each component, we can then begin to analyze how these components start to interact with each other. In this case, we identified the Adesto 16 megabit external flash memory part in the lower left-hand corner, which communicates over a SPI bus to the Silicon Labs Pearl Gecko 32-bit microcontroller. The MCU also interfaces with the NUC029Z Bluetooth module, likely via a serial interface, which we will find a little bit later on, as well as the Magtech IC, which is used to read the electromagnetic field, which is created when a card is swiped. We also identified a depopulated header that we assumed to be a Jtag interface, which is used primarily for programming and debugging the MCU. We'll discuss that in future slides, but we really had that hypothesis due to the proximity to the MCU. After we understood the major components, the next step was to try to prioritize where the sensitive data would reside. Our first path was obviously external flash memory, considering storage as the primary function of the device. And then the next step was to look into internal flash memory in the event that they were storing credit card numbers locally, or if we wanted to start to decompile and reverse engineer the firmware on the MCU itself. Lastly, if we were unable to access either flash memory, we were going to attempt to brute force the Bluetooth Classic pin using a Raspberry Pi and a USB Bluetooth module. As I mentioned previously, the first step in understanding a component is to determine the model number via the markings on the component. In this case, as you can see in the picture, the part was the Adesto AT45DB161E, which happens to be a 16-bit flash memory device. And according to our calculations, it is capable of storing approximately 250,000 credit card numbers. A common protocol for interfacing with external flash memory is over a serial peripheral interface, or SPI bus. This protocol is commonly used in PCBs due to its high data rate and the ability to have several devices connected to the same data lines. The data sheet also contained critical information on the pinout, which helped us in soldering to the appropriate pins, as you can see on the left side picture. And lastly, I will also mention that soldering small electronics like this is relatively difficult. However, it could be made a lot easier with the proper IC clips, which allow you to avoid soldering altogether. So the next step was figuring out how we actually want to interface with the external flash memory device. So what you can see in the far left is the pinout for a Raspberry Pi 4 specifically. So it has a SPI interface on board that we can utilize. And then the picture in the center just demonstrates how we were able to pin out the Raspberry Pi 4 and utilize a breadboard to connect directly to the Adesto part that we had previously soldered to. The key part here is we had to understand how to disable the MCU from communicating with the SPI device. The nature of SPI, we cannot read from two different devices at one time. So if the MCU is trying to interact with the Adesto part, it could corrupt the data that we're receiving from that device. So there are a few different ways to go about disabling the MCU. The first, probably most common way, is to desolder the Adesto flash memory part. However, this introduces some complexities with potentially destroying the device, whether you get the device too hot while desoldering it, or if you pry it open and crack some of the internals of the device. It introduces a lot of complexity and danger, especially with this application, where if we lose the component, we potentially lose all of the information that was exfiltrated from the actual skimming exercise. So we wanted to stay away from that. Another option is to cut the traces directly to the MCU. And the way that that's done is we identify the traces either on the top or bottom layers of the board, and can use something like an X-Acto knife to electrically disconnect by just cutting the traces on the PCB. However, this brings up another issue where sometimes the traces aren't readily accessible, as well as if you ever need to reconnect it, it is not trivial to reconnect traces. It takes a very high level of skill in soldering to do that. So our method for holding the MCU in reset was to identify the pin, as you see in the picture to the right. This happens to be the reset pin of the MCU. And if we hold this pin to ground, we're actually able to keep the MCU from booting as intended, and therefore able to interface to the Adesto part with the Raspberry Pi without any external interaction from any additional components on the device. And once everything has been electrically connected appropriately, and then the MCU has been held in reset, it's as easy as running a flash ROM command to use the Raspberry Pi SPI interface and then write directly to a file. And this flash ROM interface is just it's a common tool that's used for reading external memory devices. It has the specifics for interfacing with different external flash memory parts over SPI. So it really removes a lot of the complexity in reading from these external devices. So the next step was to try to understand what was in internal flash. As I mentioned previously, our primary threat vector there was through the Jtag interface that we assumed to be directly connected to the EFM32 by that depopulated header. So what we wanted to do first was, once again, understand the actual specifics of the Pearl Gecko part that's being used. In this case, we were able to find the data sheet and identify the actual Jtag pins, as you can see on the picture to the left. So TCK, TMS, SWO, TDI, and TDO were all used to interface with the device. And then, as you can see in the pinout to the right, we can find where these actual pins were on the board. And then it's as simple as running a continuity test with a standard multimeter, and we can determine which header points are connected to which debug interface. And from there, we can simply just solder additional wire directly to that header and pin it out to a breadboard, as you saw earlier. After we were connected to the MCU on the skimmer itself, we wanted to set up our debugger to connect to the MCU from that end as well. So what we had to do here was to understand the Jtag pinout for a 20 pin, in this case, a Sager J-Link. So it's very straightforward. Simply connect the same Jtag pins to the MCU. And then from there, it's as simple as running, in this case, the Sager JMEM tool, and you can connect directly to the MCU and read all of the contents of the internal flash memory. So after that, we were analyzing the text entries specifically in the internal flash memory. We noticed distinct entries where things were being stored as text. And based on the notation in which they were stored, we assumed that they were AT commands, which are likely used to interface with the Bluetooth module over a serial interface, like I mentioned. This is very common with modules specifically. There's a simplified interface where the MCU simply has to write these payloads over UART or I2C or something along those lines to interface with the Bluetooth module, and the module contains its own stack for the actual Bluetooth. So as you can see here, we were able to identify the Bluetooth broadcasting name as Las Vegas, which we could confirm by sniffing the Bluetooth traffic. And then we were also able to confirm that the 1357 pin was in fact the true pin, and it allowed us to bypass the brute forcing of the Bluetooth interface because we went to internal flash first. Oops. All right, so now that we had the data, we really wanted to understand what was out there and what we were really looking for. So the first thing I'll mention is with external flash memory, it looked like the data had not been written to. It was effectively empty with basically just the formatting at the top of the external flash. Our theory that we like to think is that it was too difficult for the controllers of the MCU firmware to actually interface with SPI flash. It's not incredibly trivial. So somebody that doesn't have a history of embedded software development may not be able to figure out how to interface with SPI flash in that sense. So our next step was to understand if things were stored in internal flash memory, which is significantly easier. If you're already writing code on the EFM32, for instance, it's very easy to identify some sort of region to start storing credit card numbers. So in order to do this, we wanted to create an algorithm to identify when we think a credit card number is being stored. So to do this, we wrote an algorithm to understand if cards are being stored in 8-bit fashion, 16-bit, or 32-bit, as well as determining if they were big or little Indian. So once we had those checks, we would run through and determine sequences. And if we had a sequence that matched a valid credit card number, at least in the proper range, that was flagged and then ran through a LUN algorithm, which is a mathematical operation for determining if a card is valid. That's pretty easy to program into our script. And from there, we were able to determine that there were 95 valid credit card numbers, and it was pretty evenly distributed throughout internal flash. And the distribution of these valid credit card numbers is very important. We feel strongly that these instances are anomalies or random as part of the MCU flash memory, just because of the nature and where they're stored. So in the picture to the left, you can see the valid credit card number that was obviously redacted, and then you can see the address in which it was found. So this is somewhat telling. If it's distributed across the flash memory, the developers of the MCU firmware have to understand where these credit card numbers reside in flash memory. If they were to operate on a credit card number accidentally, they could effectively break their operation and cause the MCU to go into a hard fault condition. So they would either have to determine a very specific region or write a very complex memory algorithm to understand when they can execute in memory and when they can't. So as you can see in the entropy analysis of the firmware image, the data was pretty consistent in the firmware image up until the end of the firmware from what we can gather. And we don't see any other instances of entropy being stored on the device. So from that, we inferred that there's no dedicated region to storing credit card numbers. So those credit card numbers would have to reside in that application firmware space as well, if they were there at all.
All right, so let's take a look at the next steps. We would like to have kept going, but the client was satisfied with the extent to which we had tested. Unfortunately, that meant we could not continue. Had we been able to, these would have been the next steps. So first, we would have attempted to decompile the firmware. This would allow us to get a better understanding and determine if the credit card numbers are being stored in some novel way. We would like to identify if there was a kill switch type function in place to delete the data after some amount of idle time. We would also like to see if any encryption methods were used in storing of the credit card numbers. And so next, we would further analyze the Bluetooth interface. With the Bluetooth pin used for connecting to the skimmer, we could hopefully determine the intended method for exfiltrating that skimmed credit card data. Finally, we would have liked to analyze the skimmer in a live environment. This would help us determine where credit card info is intended to be stored and if there are any controls in place to secure that data. And that test would require the skimmer to be connected to a live POS system. So why should you care? Well, we were easily able to access the data on this device. That doesn't bode well for anyone. Hardware and embedded devices are increasingly a part of our daily lives. Devices like medical equipment, for example, are a target for hackers. That's bad for patients. That can lead to a disruption of potentially life-saving treatment or disclosure of personal or health information. And that's bad for companies. For example, those operating under GDPR, the data privacy regulations in Europe, and those fines can be hundreds of millions of dollars. We were happy to be able to access the data on this skimming device, but we'd like to help well-intentioned devices not suffer from these same vulnerabilities. Again, we are not going to help you build a better skimmer, but I'll pass it back to Caleb to go over some of these mitigations in further detail.
Sure. Thanks, Zane. So the first obvious idea for a mitigation would be to use encryption. So the recommendation for encryption is pretty standard here. You can rely on AES 128, 192, or 256. And then you must use a secure mode of encryption, such as CBC. Do not use ECB. And then also maintaining a secure key distribution model is imperative to rolling out encryption on embedded devices. However, encryption can be tricky on hardware devices just because it is still prone to what's known as side channel attacks. So I'll go over a few different side channel attacks and a possible mitigation and what that means to your devices and the business as a whole. So the first attack that I'll discuss is power analysis, both differential power analysis and correlated power analysis. So an example of differential power analysis is looking at cycles and being able to infer operation based on the power consumption with two different cycles, right? So a very simplistic example of differential power analysis would be in the event of like a password protected bootloader. If we were able to determine the power transient of a correct character versus an incorrect character based on how the MCU handles that data, what we can do is brute force the attack and connect directly to the MCU that's hosting the bootloader, and we can brute force that password pretty quickly by simply analyzing the power analysis of each of those characters. And another example of power analysis is known as correlated power analysis, where the correlation between what's known as Hamming weight values to AES guesses in this case can be used to crack encryption within approximately 5 minutes. So to take a step back, when data lines are driven high, as you can see in the figure to the top left, it requires power. So the theory behind this is that when a data line is high, it requires a level of power. And then if multiple data lines are high, or if multiple bits, right, are high or one, it would require more power than a bit level that is lower. And that's referred to as Hamming weight, the number of bits that are high. So the theory is if we can correlate Hamming weight value to power measurement, then we can start to make some assumptions based on what we see from a power measurement perspective, typically in terms of AES. So as you can see in the middle graph there, this correlation is linear. So as you go up in Hamming weight value, you also go up in power consumption. So then what that enables us to do is target AES. So in this case, we can target AES, the encryption cycles, the first round of encryption. If we're able to capture the plain text before it gets encrypted, as well as the power consumption, what we can do is compute the guess of the subkey by running it through the substitution byte process, and then we can use that substitution byte and convert it to a Hamming weight value, and then correlate that data set with the power consumption, and then determine using what's known as a Pearson correlation coefficient. We can determine the highest correlation between two data sets, and then once we can confirm the highest correlation between the data sets, we can do that for each subkey, and then essentially brute force and guess the AES key using completely side channel attacks. And as I mentioned, we can do this pretty effectively with as little as 50 power traces. So as long as getting the configuration set up and understanding when encryption is happening, this can be done pretty quickly from an execution perspective. And this is all done using, at least we use the Chip Whisperer Pro, and it's shown in the bottom left picture there, connected to a target board for testing purposes. I will also mention that the CPA type attacks can be used for decryption. So in the event that we can capture ciphertext and analyze the decryption cycles of AES, we can backwards calculate the last round AES key, and then it's easy to compute the first round AES key from there. And then also the fault attacks, as I mentioned, VCC and clock glitching can be used to skip security checks entirely by causing the MCU to operate or to load the next instruction prior to executing the previous. And cold boot attacks are nothing new as well, where you can use something like a freeze spray to cool down memory and extract the contents before they've dissipated. So the mitigation to this is a secure element. So various secure elements have different capabilities. A significant amount of them are able to perform random operations that can draw power to mitigate against power analysis type of attacks. They can detect abnormalities in voltage rails and clock signals to prevent faulted attacks. And then some secure elements can also observe sudden changes in environmental conditions to mitigate against cold boot type attacks. These devices also implement significant tamper mechanisms to prevent access to the authentication keys that are typically flashed onto the device itself. The only caveat to these secure elements is that they do cost money. So if you're talking about a very low cost IoT device, the cost of implementing a secure element may not be prudent, but we wanted to make sure and communicate to you the implications of simply relying on AES encryption in your embedded devices. So another category of mitigations are hardware mitigations, and none of these are the end-all be-all mitigation by any means. I think these need to be coupled with several mitigations to just add extra layers of security to your device. The first one I'll mention here is pin obfuscation. Essentially what we saw in the skimmer was a depopulated header where the vias were in a line directly connected next to the MCU. So we kind of knew just looking at it exactly what that was. So in production applications, you can obfuscate the pins by having different vias spread throughout the board for Jtag, UART, SPI, I2C, anything along those lines that can obscure what that looks like to just increase the level of entry for connecting to those interfaces. However, there are tools such as the Jtagulator, which allows you to brute force unknown pins by running boundary scans, by sending data to understand RX and TX lines with a pretty easy to use interface. We were also able to read over the Jtag interface pretty easily. So most MCUs support read protection, where you can simply disable that capability in production, which in production revisions of your devices, read protection should always be disabled. Bga Packages is another good step. As you saw with the Adesto part, we were able to connect directly to the component. Similarly, MCUs often use what's known as a QFP package, as seen on the right. These pins are very easy to connect to, pry up, or bridge if necessary. Whereas the BGA on the left, the pads are all underneath, and it is very difficult to remove or modify without specialized tools and any skill. And then lastly, don't tell us exactly where the Jtag interface is. That makes it very easy. As you can see in the bottom right, we can see the TDO, TMS, TCK all in line there. And lastly, the Bluetooth mitigations. They were using Bluetooth Classic. So in modern Bluetooth versions, you can increase their 4-digit pin to an 8-digit pin. As I mentioned with Bluetooth Classic, if you're using anything less than or equal to 2.0, you should be using secure mode 3. If you're using anything greater than 2.1, you can use the AES 128 encryption that's on the link layer. We would recommend using BLE if it's possible, specifically with out-of-band pairing or passkey or numeric comparison. In terms of out-of-band pairing, either something like NFC or a QR code is usually sufficient for exchanging those keys in a more secure manner. If you're using BLE less than 4.2, you can use the legacy pairing methods. Anything greater than or equal to 4.2, we can rely on the secure pairing methods. And then Bluetooth 5 is relatively new. We haven't seen a ton of exposure to it yet. However, they do have a seemingly more robust methodology of key exchange. However, the best mitigation to Bluetooth is to not use it. So the NSA has discussed how insecure Bluetooth is as a protocol. So we would recommend using, if possible, Wi-Fi Direct, NFC, NFMI, or LTE, specifically NB-IoT, when at all possible. And that's all that we had today. So if you have any questions, we'd be happy to discuss on the forum. Thanks.
Thank you.